Rain drummed against the ICU windows like a metronome nobody could ignore. The monitors kept time anyway, green lines climbing and falling with a composure that made grief feel indecently loud. Somewhere beyond the glass, helicopters carved the night into moving shadows, and every thudding rotor felt like a countdown that would not wait for anyone to be ready. He stood beside the bed in a suit he hadn't meant to wear this long, collar loosened, tie abandoned in his pocket like a small surrender. Ethan Cole had negotiated mergers with a calm that could freeze a room, but this was a different kind of deal. Doctors had pronounced brain death after the aneurysm burst, and the patience with which they explained the exam, the pupils, the apnea test, the absence of brainstem reflexes left him nowhere to hide. His wife's hand was warm, skin soft with the residual heat of a body that machines still perfused, but warmth didn't equal life anymore, and he felt the language of it break inside him. When the transplant coordinator stepped in, crisp badge, careful eyes, voice low and practiced, he realized this was the moment when love had to look like paperwork. They did not push, they knew better than to push. The coordinator spoke about organ procurement organizations and the registry. How Ava had signed up years ago in one of those optimistic moments that people have at the DMV, checking a box without picturing this room. The words "her heart is strong" landed with a weight that made his throat lock. In another wing, a patient with end-stage cardiomyopathy waited on inotropes, a Milrinone drip teasing a fragile heart to keep going while the list, the algorithms, and the antigen matches tried to decide if hope had an address tonight. He listened to the fax blood type, HLA typing. The timeline dictated by cold ischemic time while his mind tugged on the one thread he could still control. Whether this body that used to turn toward him in sleep would leave the room in parts to be parceled out as futures. He signed. He did it because Ava hated unfinished things and loved practical kindness more than speeches, because she had told him once in the car casually, like mentioning a grocery list, that if anything ever happened, she wanted to be useful to someone else's morning. The consent forms took on the gravity of vows he hadn't been able to save, and he wrote his name in a hand that stayed steady out of reflex rather than conviction. He memorized the coordinator's careful language about anonymity, the possibility of letters through the program, the ethics of contact, the way the system guarded both families from the rawness of the other's dreams. The procurement team arrived in quiet choreography. When they wheeled her away, her hair tucked into a disposable cap, a small strip of it escaping like a ribbon of memory, he walked alongside the bed until the red line where he had to stop. In the hall he caught pieces of the world behaving as always, a vending machine failing to deliver a bag of chips, a resident dictating notes into a cracked phone, a janitor buffing the floor until it shone like water. The doors to the OR swung with a hush that felt ceremonial. He pressed his palm to the cool push plate, and a nurse told him softly that the cross clamp would go on within the hour, that the organ would be flushed, packed on ice and preservation solution, labeled under times that mattered more than poems, and flown out before the first light ate the rain. He learned the liturgy of transplant the way exhausted people learn new languages: tacrolimus, mycophenolate, steroids, ischemic time and reperfusion injury, the quiet terror of rejection named like weather: hyperacute, acute, chronic, each with its own storm signature. He hated every word for existing and loved them for translating his wife into oxygen moving again through a stranger's skin. In a family room that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, he stared at a laminated sheet explaining how recipients sometimes wrote to donor families through the OPO. Letters rooted and anonymized, no last names, no dates, only the bare minimum of a life that had been rescued. He wondered if he would want to know the handwriting of the person who got Ava's heart, whether seeing the loops of their letters would make the loss real in a different dimension. The hospital shifted to morning with the indifference of a city that keeps waking. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had gentled into a mist that lit streetlights into halos, and the helicopter pad above the annex hummed like a tired star. He tucked his hands into his coat for something to do, stood under the awning, watched a transport team load a sealed cooler into a van with a speed that never broke into rush. They drove away with the measured urgency of people who know exactly how many minutes they're managing, and he understood viscerally how a heart becomes both clock and cargo. In the days that followed, time lost its edges. He avoided the elevator that smelled like antiseptic and daisies from a gift shop bouquet, took the stairs until his knees ached, wandered the corridors like someone in witness protection from their own life. He found reasons to pass the cardiac step-down unit, staring at the board with bed numbers that meant nothing to him. Imagining a woman or a man propped up against pillows, hands still stuck with tape, chest rising cautiously while a nurse adjusted oxygen and a monitor sang in reassuring beeps. The transplant team would be checking endomyocardial biopsies, watching for lymphocytic infiltration that spelled danger, adjusting immunosuppression like the tuning knobs of an old radio. He held onto those details because they gave him a place to put his feelings that wasn't a memory loop of Ava laughing in the kitchen with a tea towel over her shoulder. On the third morning, a social worker guided him to a quiet office, blinds half closed, a bowl of peppermint candies arranged like a small kindness that knew its limits. She told him the surgery had gone well. She couldn't tell him who, where, or even which city. She could say the words successful reperfusion and stable in CICU, and those were enough to trip his breath. He asked if recipients ever wrote first, whether gratitude could find its way toward him like a letter that had memorized his need without knowing his address. The social worker nodded, sometimes months, sometimes years, sometimes never, and every outcome was a kind of mercy. That night he went home for the first time since the aneurysm. The penthouse felt indecently alive with the hum of appliances and the soft complaint of a radiator, little domestic sounds that pretended nothing had changed. He stood at the kitchen island where Ava had left a bowl of clementines, one with a thumbprint he knew was hers, and he almost reached for his phone to text her the small joke she would have made about their scent. He slept on the couch without turning off the hall light, waking in shreds to a body that kept trying to reprogram failure into a problem he could fix by staying a few hours later at the office. In the morning he called the OPA and asked about writing a letter. They gave him guidelines. Keep it first names only. Keep it about Ava, if you wanted, about who she was. No details that could triangulate identity. He opened his laptop and stared at a blank document, fingers floating, realizing how much he had always relied on her to begin things that mattered. He wrote anyway. He wrote about the way she kept Basil alive on a sun-starved windowsill, about how she hated goodbyes and turned them into see you soon, about the way she would touch her chest when music surprised her, palm pressed like she was making sure her own rhythm understood what it had been handed. He told them that on the DMV day she had called him to brag about finally getting the photo right, and how proud she sounded when she mentioned checking that small box. He didn't ask for anything, though a part of him wanted to beg for one line back, a syllable to prove the decision had not been an abstraction. He saved the file with a generic name and emailed the coordinator, feeling the strange peace of choosing a verb that didn't end in loss. 2 weeks later, the hospital air smelled different, winter beginning to thread itself into the vents, and Ethan returned to sign probate papers with a lawyer who moved like grief was a familiar client. He walked through the lobby and paused at the cardiac rehab posters, those glossy photos of people on treadmills with wires and careful smiles. A nurse passed by with a stack of charts pressed to her uniform, her hair pulled back, her focus the particular blend of compassion and triage that this floor asked of people. She glanced at him the way staff glance at all the lost ones who stand still too long, and something in her gaze made him inhale like the first breath after surfacing. It wasn't recognition, it was a steadiness he had only ever seen on faces that had walked right up to the line where life negotiates with mathematics. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that this floor had recently learned to whisper one new patient's story the way nurses do when hope outperforms protocol. He didn't know that the woman who passed him had spent the last 6 months moving through the world like a candle tunneling down to its last clean circle of wax, that she now felt a drum in her chest that wasn't defeat. All he knew was that his feet had moved without permission, that he was standing at the edge of a corridor he had no reason to walk, and that the hospital, this building that had overseen the revision of his life, suddenly felt like a place where something unfinished might be allowed to continue. 3 months later, spring had pushed its way back into the city, but inside the hospital everything still smelled like antiseptic and winter. Ethan Cole returned for a follow-up meeting with the transplant coordinator, a formality, they said. In reality, he had agreed because routine, even one wrapped in grief, was better than the silence that waited for him in his penthouse. The office was the same as before, blinds half closed, soft light leaking through slats like pieces of memory. He sat with a stillness that had become his new fluency, nodding when the coordinator explained that a letter from the recipient had arrived through official channels. It was optional, they reminded him. He could read it or not. He took the envelope without speaking, the paper already warm from his hands before he even opened it. Her handwriting was neat, the kind that belonged to people who tried to keep their emotions in straight lines. "I don't know how to begin," the letter said. "Every beat I feel reminds me that it once belonged to someone who loved deeply. I can't thank you enough, though the words feel small. Please know that her heart is strong, and it sings." Ethan didn't realize he had been holding his breath until the words blurred. The signature read only Grace, no address, no last name, just Grace. He folded the paper, placed it back into the envelope, and sat there until the coordinator excused herself gently, leaving him alone with the sound of air conditioning and something inside him trying to restart. He didn't look for her right away. For weeks he carried the name like a forbidden word, something that burned if spoken aloud. He went back to work, to the glass towers and the endless meetings where empathy was a currency no one traded. His board thought he was recovering well, controlled, reliable, unshaken. They didn't see how often he would pause mid-sentence, waiting for a heartbeat that wasn't his to remind him he was still capable of feeling something. At night he sometimes caught himself scrolling through the hospital's foundation website, through lists of donors, staff, patient stories. Each Grace he found became a small possibility he could never verify. It was a chance encounter that broke the silence. A corporate partnership meeting, something about funding cardiac rehab centers. His company had pledged a donation to expand the wing that carried his wife's name. When he arrived at the hospital auditorium, journalists hovered, cameras clicked, executives smiled the way they do when grief becomes philanthropy. He stood at the podium, said all the expected words about legacy, research, hope, but while his mouth performed duty, his eyes caught movement at the edge of the room. A woman seated near the back, her hand resting lightly over her chest as though steadying something within her. She had that quiet composure of someone who had been on both sides of fragility. After the speeches, he tried not to notice her, but his body disobeyed. He found himself walking through the corridor outside the event hall, waiting, pretending to look at his phone. When she passed, he turned slightly, enough to see her profile. Early 30s, dark blonde hair tied loosely, a small scar visible near her collarbone, surgical, recent. Their eyes met for only a second, but something about her stillness, her measured breath, struck him harder than any word could. It wasn't recognition. It was the unprovoked certainty that his life had just shifted again. He didn't approach her. He couldn't. There were ethical boundaries, administrative protocols, the unspoken rule that donor families and recipients were never supposed to cross. But that night, her image returned to him in fragments, the calm line of her shoulders, the color returning to her cheeks, the faint pulse at her throat. He dreamed of Ava for the first time in months. She stood in their old kitchen, light falling across her face, humming something he couldn't place. When she turned toward him, she said only one word, "Listen." He woke with tears and the sound of a heartbeat that didn't feel like his own. The next week, the hospital called to confirm a follow-up meeting about his foundation's funding. He said yes without hesitation, though the logic of it felt thin. When he arrived, the same atrium smelled of coffee and disinfectant, that strange blend of life resuming where pain had once been absolute. Near the cafe, he saw her again, the woman from the ceremony, Grace, though he still hadn't said her name aloud. She was talking to a nurse, her laugh soft, cautious, as if reeling joy. There was no mistaking the small horizontal scar just beneath the collarbone, the way her hand occasionally drifted there unconsciously. He told himself it was coincidence, but when she turned and their eyes met across the polished floor, something impossible happened. He felt his chest tighten, not with pain but with recognition so pure it felt physical. The rhythm in his chest stumbled, caught, and aligned with something invisible between them. Grace's smile faltered for an instant, replaced by a quiet confusion, like someone remembering a melody without knowing why. Then the nurse spoke her name, "Grace, you can head upstairs now," and the sound of it anchored everything he had tried to deny. He didn't follow her that day. He stood still as she disappeared into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft pneumatic sigh that felt like fate closing a chapter he hadn't finished reading. He walked to the exit, sunlight cutting across the atrium's glass walls, and for the first time since Ava's death, he felt something raw and dangerous stirring under the grief, the pulse of curiosity, of hope, of the unbearable thought that maybe love doesn't end, it changes its address. Ethan told himself he wouldn't return, but the lie lasted only 3 days. He found reasons, meetings about logistics, PR interviews, donor appreciation events, anything to bring him back to the place where he had seen her. Each time, he caught fragments of her presence before losing her again. A glimpse through the glass of the rehab gym, her hand resting on a treadmill railing. The echo of her voice down a hallway as she spoke with her doctor, gentle but steady, like someone slowly trusting her body again. The hospital had become its own kind of purgatory, not of suffering, but of suspension. Life and death mingled in the air, and every monitor beeped like a metronome for borrowed time. He learned the rhythms of this place by accident. Morning rounds at 7, visiting hours at noon, the sudden stillness at 3 when the post-surgery patients slept under the low hum of ventilators. He never spoke to her, but every time he passed her floor, the world seemed to narrow to the sound of footsteps and heartbeats, one mechanical, one human, both too familiar. He didn't plan the encounter that finally broke the distance. It happened on a gray afternoon when the hospital's lights looked like stars trapped behind glass. He was signing donation documents in the administrative wing when the coordinator excused herself, saying she needed to check on a patient in cardiac rehab. The name on the file she left behind was unmistakable, Grace Holloway. The letters seemed to breathe, to hum, like something alive. He waited for her to return, hands motionless over the papers, until the decision made itself. He followed. The rehab ward smelled of antiseptic and faint citrus, the kind of place where hope was cautiously measured in steps per minute. Through the glass wall, he saw her walking slowly on the treadmill, wires tracing from her chest to the monitor beside her. A physiotherapist stood nearby, monitoring her vitals, nodding encouragement. Her movements were careful, precise, almost reverent, like someone aware that every step was borrowed from a stranger's goodbye. Her skin glowed with that pale luminosity of recovery, and sweat darkened the collar of her shirt. When she paused to catch her breath, her hand went instinctively to her heart, fingers pressing over it as if feeling for the truth. Ethan stood there longer than he should have. Long enough for her to notice the reflection of a man in the glass. Their eyes met not through air, but through that thin transparent barrier where one world watched another. Her expression shifted, curiosity first, then a flicker of something else, something that startled them both. She tilted her head, as if trying to place a face she couldn't remember. He almost smiled, a reflex he hadn't felt in months. The physiotherapist adjusted her sensors, told her she was doing great, and Grace nodded absently, eyes still on the reflection. When she finally stepped off the treadmill, he turned to leave, but her voice stopped him, soft, tentative. "Excuse me, have we met?" He froze, every word he had rehearsed dissolving before it reached his mouth. "I don't think so," he said, the syllables tasting like ash. She smiled, polite, the kind of smile given to strangers in hospital corridors. "You just look familiar," she added, and for a moment, he wanted to tell her everything about Ava, about the donation, about the nights he'd imagined this exact moment. But instead, he nodded, whispered maybe, and walked away before the truth could betray him. That night, sleep avoided him. He lay in the dark, eyes fixed on the ceiling, replaying her voice, its warmth, its hesitancy, the quiet music in it. It was different from Ava's, yet somehow echoed her cadence, the way she softened her sentences at the end, as if leaving room for tenderness. He pressed his hand to his chest and felt the old ache rise again, not grief this time, but something stranger, like recognition born from a wound. He tried to reason with himself. The human brain looks for patterns, for meaning. This was just coincidence, chemistry, neurons chasing familiarity. But when he closed his eyes, he could almost feel the space between them, filled with a rhythm that belonged to both of them and neither. It was impossible to prove, but he was certain that heartbeats remembered. A week later, he saw her again in the Atrium Cafe. She was reading a book, a paper cup of coffee beside her, and for the first time, he noticed how she occasionally touched her chest when she laughed, the same unconscious gesture Ava used to make when something truly amused her. He didn't approach. He didn't have to. The sound of her laughter was enough to pull him back from the edge of the quiet life he had been living since the donation. He realized then that fate wasn't cruel. It was precise. And whatever law of nature had decided that Ava's heart would end up in Grace Holloway's chest had written him into that story for a reason. Not to fall in love. Not yet. But to remember what it felt like to be alive again. The next time they spoke, it wasn't planned. He had just finished a board meeting with the hospital's foundation when the elevator doors opened and there she was, Grace, carrying a folder pressed against her chest, her hair loose this time, catching the sterile light like something alive. They both hesitated, as if the building itself had arranged the timing. She smiled first. "You again," she said softly, her tone halfway between surprise and recognition. He returned the smile, gentler than he'd intended. "Seems like we both spend too much time here." They walked side by side through the hallway, both pretending not to notice how the silence between them wasn't awkward at all. It was alive, waiting to be named. She told him she was in cardiac rehab, rebuilding her strength, learning how to trust her own body again. He listened, not as a businessman or a donor, but as someone rediscovering the fragile architecture of connection. "I used to count every heartbeat," she said, eyes fixed ahead. "Every single one. I was terrified it would stop. Now I wake up and I just listen. It feels different, stronger, but not mine." "Does that make sense?" He nodded slowly. "Maybe it's both," he said, and the words left his mouth before he could stop them. "Maybe it's yours now, but it remembers where it came from." She stopped walking, her breath caught, almost imperceptibly, as if the air had briefly thickened. He thought he'd gone too far, but then she smiled again, a faint, searching smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You sound like someone who's lost something," she murmured. He looked down, forcing a small laugh. "Maybe I have." They reached the hospital courtyard, the late afternoon light spilling across the glass panels and surgical wings. She sat on a bench, motioning for him to join her. The garden was small but carefully maintained, rosemary bushes, trimmed hedges, a faint smell of wet soil after morning rain. A few patients walked slowly between paths, ivy poles rolling beside them like quiet companions. "I had a donor," she said, almost to herself. "They don't tell us much, but I know she was young, healthy." The coordinator said it was sudden. "Sometimes I feel like I should be grateful every second of the day, but mostly I'm just haunted, like I'm living someone else's unfinished story." Ethan's hands tightened in his lap, the words landed like static in his chest. "Maybe unfinished stories are meant to find someone who can continue them," he said quietly. "Not erase them, just carry them forward." She looked at him then, really looked, and something passed between them, an understanding too large for language. Neither of them moved. The wind brushed a loose strand of hair across her face, and instinctively he reached out, stopping halfway, catching himself before he crossed the fragile border that neither of them could see. She tucked the hair behind her ear and smiled again, this time smaller, safer. "You talk like someone who's seen too many endings." "I run a company," he said. "Endings come with the job." But his voice betrayed him. There was tenderness in it, not irony. They sat in silence after that, watching the sunlight fade over the courtyard. The moment was simple, but to Ethan it felt enormous, like gravity shifting underfoot. When she stood to leave, she hesitated, then turned back. "You never told me your name." He hesitated. "Ethan," he said finally. "Ethan Cole." Her lips parted slightly. The name seemed to linger in her mind, like a word she had heard before but couldn't place. She nodded once, smiled faintly, and walked away. He stayed on the bench long after she was gone, hands trembling with the effort of restraint. He thought of Ava, of the moment he'd signed the consent forms, the sterile weight of the pen, the echo of her voice saying be useful to someone else's morning. He realized that maybe this was what she meant. Maybe this meeting wasn't a coincidence, but a continuation. That night, Ethan stood on his apartment balcony overlooking the city lights. He pressed his hand over his chest and whispered her name, Grace, like a confession to the dark. Somewhere, he knew, another heart was beating with that same rhythm. Not just Ava's, not just Grace's. Something shared now, something quietly eternal. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed again and again, at the hospital cafe, near the garden benches, once even in the elevator where time seemed to fold between them like pages pressed too close. It never felt planned, yet never random either. Their conversations deepened without permission, woven with pauses that carried more meaning than the words themselves. Grace talked about the strange weight of recovery. About waking up at night to the rhythm in her chest that felt foreign and familiar at once. "It's like there's a memory inside me," she said one afternoon, her voice soft over the hum of distant machines. "Sometimes I get flashes, faces I've never seen, places I can't name. It's probably nothing. But when I walk into this hospital, It's like something inside me recognizes it before I do. Ethan listened, motionless. He didn't dare speak, afraid that even breathing too loudly might unravel the fragile thread holding them together. Bodies remember, he said at last, even when we think they don't. She tilted her head, studying him, as though trying to read something in his silence. You talk like someone who's lived this before, she said, half teasing, half curious. He smiled faintly. Maybe I just believe that nothing really disappears. They spent that afternoon walking the hospital's inner courtyard. Grace stopped often to catch her breath, not from weakness, but from awe. She touched the leaves, closed her eyes to feel the sunlight on her skin, and once, without realizing it, she hummed a tune. Ethan froze. It was the same melody Ava used to hum absent-mindedly when she cooked, a fragment of a song he hadn't heard since the night before her surgery. He didn't interrupt. He just watched her, heart thudding in sync with something deeper than reason. Grace noticed his stillness and smiled awkwardly. Sorry, I don't even know what that song is. It's been in my head since the operation. He forced a breath. It's beautiful, he said quietly. You should keep it. Later that evening, she invited him for coffee, an unplanned gesture that felt natural. The cafe near the hospital was nearly empty, its fluorescent lights soft and forgiving. She told him about the months before her transplant, the waiting, the exhaustion, the surrender that comes when you've said goodbye too many times. He told her only fragments, how he had lost someone, how he had learned to live with the silence she left behind. Neither of them said the word wife. Neither of them said heart. When the cafe closed, they walked toward the parking lot. The night was cool, and the sound of the city was muffled by distance. She pulled her coat tighter and smiled at him. You make it easy to talk, she said. That's rare. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and for a moment he saw both women at once. Ava's warmth, Grace's light, the same heart bridging the impossible. He felt the pull of something sacred and terrifying. Maybe we're both just tired of silence, he said. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded paper, and hesitated before handing it to him. This, I don't know why, but I wanted to show you. It's the letter I wrote to my donor's family. The one they said would be delivered anonymously. I never knew if it reached anyone, but it mattered to me. He took it gently, his throat tightening as he recognized his own name written at the bottom of the version he had received, Grace. The same careful handwriting, the same trembling gratitude, the same impossible connection. He looked up, and for the first time, the full truth pressed between them like a pulse neither could silence. You wrote this? He asked softly. Yes, she whispered, and sure of his tone. Why? Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. His chest rose and fell once, twice. He wanted to tell her everything, that her heartbeat once belonged to his wife, that he had watched the monitors fade, that he had signed the papers believing he was ending something, not beginning it. But he couldn't. The moment was too fragile, too alive, so he folded the letter carefully, handed it back, and said only, it reached the right person. Grace smiled, tears catching the light in her eyes, though she didn't know why she was crying. She pressed her hand to her chest, over the heart that wasn't entirely hers, and whispered, I'm glad. He nodded, barely holding himself together. And as she turned to leave, he felt it, a single heartbeat inside him sensing with the rhythm of hers, steady, certain, alive. That night, Ethan realized that some truths were too big for confession. They had to live quietly, pulsing beneath the skin, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The truth didn't leave him alone after that night. It lived in the spaces between his thoughts, in the quiet moments before sleep, when memory and reality blurred into something neither cruel nor kind, just persistent. Every time he saw Grace, it felt like standing at the edge of a precipice between two lives, the one he had lost, and the one he wasn't sure he was allowed to begin. They met again 2 days later, this time outside the hospital. She was sitting on the stone steps, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The city pulsed around them, cars passing, nurses changing shifts, the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but between them, there was only silence. You look like you haven't slept, she said, glancing up at him. He smiled faintly, sitting beside her. Maybe I forgot how. Grace nodded, studying his face with that calm, precise curiosity that made him feel exposed. You always carry this sadness with you, she said softly. Like a shadow that doesn't belong to you. He wanted to tell her that it did belong to him, that it was the last thing he had left of Ava, but he also knew that saying it would change everything, that once truth is spoken aloud, it never goes back to silence. Instead, he asked, "Do you ever feel like something inside you remembers things you shouldn't?" Her expression softened. "All the time," she admitted. "Sometimes I wake up with emotions that don't feel mine. I'll start crying at songs I've never heard before, or I'll dream about people I've never met. It's strange, but it doesn't scare me anymore." She paused, touching her chest gently. "It feels like this heart knows more than I do, like it's teaching me how to live." He swallowed hard, every word slicing through him with unbearable precision. "Maybe it is," he whispered. They sat like that for a long time, two strangers connected by something that neither of them could see, listening to the rhythm that bound them. When the wind picked up, Grace shivered, and he instinctively took off his coat, draping it over her shoulders. The gesture was small, automatic, but it made her eyes glisten. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You always show up when I don't realize I need someone." Ethan smiled, but it trembled. "Maybe that's just coincidence." She shook her head. "No, I stopped believing in coincidence the day I woke up with someone else's heart." They shared a quiet laugh that didn't really belong to happiness, but to something softer, something like relief. Then, after a while, Grace spoke again. "I'm leaving soon," she said, almost apologetically. "My doctor says I can finally go home. I live by the coast, small town, quiet. I came to thank the people who saved me, but I think I found more than I expected." Ethan's chest tightened. "You deserve peace," he said, though the words nearly broke him. She smiled, eyes searching his. "You, too?" For a moment, they just looked at each other, the city fading behind them, the world reduced to breath and silence. Then she stood, adjusting his coat around her shoulders. "Maybe we'll meet again someday," she said, and for the first time, her voice carried no question, only calm certainty. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just watched as she walked down the steps, her pace steady and sure. When she reached the sidewalk, she turned once more, smiling as the light caught her hair. Then she disappeared into the flow of the city, leaving him alone on the hospital steps. That night, Ethan returned to the apartment that had felt like a museum of grief. The air still smelled faintly of her perfume, of rain against the glass. He poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and pressed his hand to his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of absence. He felt movement, faint but certain. A heartbeat that wasn't his, yet somehow was. A rhythm that refused to fade. He closed his eyes, and somewhere deep within that quiet, he heard Ava's voice, not in words, but in the pulse that had carried her love beyond death. It wasn't saying goodbye, it was saying, live. Months passed, and the city shifted around him, the way cities do when you stop watching them so closely. Seasons traded places. The air grew warmer, and Ethan learned to move through the world without feeling like a ghost inside his own life. He still visited the hospital sometimes, not for meetings, not for routine, just to walk the halls that had once been the border between love and loss. It no longer felt like a tomb, it felt like something sacred, like the echo of a story that had found a way to keep breathing. He had kept his distance after Grace left for the coast. It wasn't out of fear, or duty, but because he finally understood that what connected them didn't need presence to exist. He followed her recovery through the Foundation's quiet updates, her progress in cardiac rehab, her volunteer work with new transplant patients, the small photo in a newsletter showing her by the ocean, hair blown by wind, her hand resting over her chest as if grounding herself. He didn't need to hear her voice to know she was well. He could feel it, a steady pulse somewhere deep, like an invisible thread pulling gently between them. Still, some nights, when the world quieted and the rain returned to the city's rhythm, he found himself standing on the balcony, listening. Not to the traffic or the hum of the skyline, but to the silence that held her heartbeat. It was faint, but real. He could sense it the way a sailor senses the tide, not by sight, but by instinct, by gravity, by something ancient and unspoken. One morning, he received a letter. The envelope was simple, no return address, but the handwriting stopped his breath. He recognized the loops of her letters instantly. Inside, the note was brief. "I thought of you today. The tide was strong, and for the first time since the surgery, I ran without fear. I don't know why, but I wanted you to know I'm alive, and I think she is too. Thank you, Ethan, for everything you never said, and everything you did. He read it once, then again, then pressed the page against his chest. He could almost feel it, her heartbeat, Ava's, his all layered, all one. It didn't ache anymore, it pulsed, it lived. That evening, he drove to the coast. The sky hung low with soft gold light, the kind that feels both ending and beginning. When he reached the shoreline, he stood barefoot in the sand, letting the wind unravel the stiffness from his shoulders. Waves crashed and retreated in patient rhythm, the same rhythm he'd been chasing all this time. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted, he felt accompanied. He whispered her names, Ava, Grace. The wind carried them together until they were indistinguishable. He realized then that grief isn't a closed door, and love isn't something that ends. It transforms, crossing bodies, time, and circumstance until it finds another form to inhabit. He looked out over the horizon, the ocean breathing in and out, endless, and he finally understood. Some hearts don't stop beating, they just find new homes. He smiled faintly, the first true smile in a long time, and turned toward the light climbing over the water. It flickered against the waves like a pulse, steady, eternal, alive. And somewhere far away, on a quiet coastal road, Grace pressed her hand to her chest, feeling that same rhythm. Neither of them spoke, but both of them knew. The heart had found its peace,